Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, November 20th, 2008. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. With this week, homebrewer Kai Troester joins us again to take us through his experiments on attenuation. How do various factors in the mash affect our wort's fermentability, and also, to a lesser extent, our efficiency? Kai shares his extensive work with us. If you're new to home brewing and would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through both basic and more advanced brewing techniques. And you can follow me on Twitter. My username, this is all one word, Basic Brewing. Logically enough. The 2009 Brewers Logbooks and the Introduction to Wine Kits DVDs are both here. Check our online store at basicbrewingshop.com to find them. Also, our new video podcast, Basic Winemaking Video, is now available on iTunes. So you can search for that in iTunes and find it. In our first episode, Steve does a delicious food pairing with a homemade Riesling that we made from a kit. And if you're doing Christmas shopping on Amazon.com, just a reminder, please don't forget to click on the Amazon.com Associates link on basicbrewing.com before you go shopping there. Thanks very much, as always, to those who keep us in mind and do that. Kai and I had a lot to cover in this week's interview, a lot of useful information. So I want to keep the show under an hour. And so I'm going to save the mailbag until next time. The only note I do want to call attention to this week is from Andrew in Morrison, Colorado. Andrew, you may remember, was the one who wrote in a few weeks back asking how to raise his kids responsibly while at the same time enjoying his home brewing hobby and his love of good beer. And after hearing all of your input from all of your emails, Andrew says, I just wanted to write in to thank you and all the listeners for the wonderful stories and advice. He says the response was overwhelming. Obviously, this is an important topic for a lot of homebrewers. It's great to hear that so many people turn their hobby into a positive experience and a learning tool for their kids. I would appreciate it if you passed my thanks on to the listeners who wrote in. The camaraderie in the brewing community never ceases to amaze me. I'll go along with that. Thanks again to everybody who participated in the debate. Well, it was pretty one-sided if it was a debate, but the discussion, maybe. And as usual, I appreciate all the email and feedback that I get from you guys. And you can find me at james@basicbrewing.com or just use the feedback form on basicbrewing.com. Okay, if you remember, on the September 11th episode of this program, Kai Troester joined us to help us understand the concept of attenuation and the factors that affect the attenuation of our beer or the fermentability of our beer. We've heard from experts and read textbooks and magazines and websites that tell us how several factors affect attenuation and, to go along with that, efficiency in our mash. And almost all of us have just taken those recommendations as fact without much question, but not Kai. Kai has completed an extensive set of experiments that have looked into how factors such as time, temperature, pH, and others affect the potential of attenuation for a given wort. Now, if you're like me, you might find it helpful to have Kai's research in front of you as you listen to this interview. It certainly helped me to visualize the results. So I'll put a link to Kai's experiments in the description of this episode on basicbrewingradio.com. Well, Kai Troester, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
Thanks for having me back.
And we have to thank Russ Hamzi, who is your technician this time. You're a guest at his home studio, I'm assuming.
Yes, I am. And he volunteered after he heard the lousy audio quality the last time around. So he thought, hey, why don't you stop by and use my studio for recording another interview?
Oh, excellent. And thank you very much to Russ. Last time we did a show on understanding attenuation and kind of the basics of what attenuation is. But this time we want to talk about specific experiments that you did with attenuation in the mash tun specifically. But to take us back a bit, maybe for the people who haven't gone back and listened to the Understanding Attenuation show yet, can you give us kind of a nutshell explanation of what attenuation is?
The definition of attenuation is the ratio between the starting gravity and the finishing gravity, and that is a measure of how many of the sugars in the mash were actually fermented by the yeast.
Okay, so what were the objectives and the scope of your experiments?
Well, when I was thinking about just the problem of attenuation, I just came to this limit of attenuation, and in the literature I have read a lot about what certain mash parameters would do to the limit of attenuation, but at that point I haven't really had any insight into to what extent do they actually change the limit of attenuation. Do some of the parameters have a more significant impact, and do other parameters just have a very little impact? And so I thought, well, why not start a series of experiments? If it's possible to just keep the overhead for each experiment very low, then I would be able to get a lot of data points and to see what does it do to the fermentability of the wort that is produced based on what parameter I changed.
And this wasn't a small job. You did a lot of work.
Well, it was a lot of very small jobs. So none of these experiments was actually a full-scale production batch, I would almost call it. So none of them, this was a 5-gallon batch, and none of these batches were actually fermented to result in a drinkable product. The idea was to take some malt, mix it with some water in a thermos bottle to just keep the temperature. And then after that, I would dump the mash into a colander, set over a pot, and I would, after that, mix the spent grain with sparge water and lauter it again through that colander, basically doing a one sparge batch sparge. And the resulting amount of wort was just enough to fill a hydrometer twice, and for the first time to actually measure the original gravity, and then once the fermentation was done, to measure the finishing gravity so I can determine the attenuation that I achieved.
How many times did you have to do this?
So I had to do that 70 times. So it was done for each data point. There was a dough-in, a mash, a lauter, a boil, and then a fermentation. And that fermentation was actually done with dried bread yeast. And the reasoning behind that was, first, I didn't want to bother growing yeast for each of these batches or have some fresh yeast around all the time, of which I wouldn't know the viability. And I also did not want to spend a lot of money on brewer's dry yeast. And with early experiments to the fast ferment test, I found that a bread yeast actually is in its attenuation behavior very similar to brewer's yeast. So why not just use that if the jar cost me $5 and it would last for many, many experiments.
And it wasn't like you were drinking these, so.
No, I tasted a few of them, and they were just sour and phenolic, and like what you would expect if you ferment something with bread yeast.
Now, what are the parameters that you were looking for? What were the individual experiments that you were running?
So the parameters I focused on were the mash time, the actual rest temperature, then the mash pH, the fineness of the grind, the water to grist ratio, the diastatic power of the malt, so the enzyme content, and at last I actually also evaluated the amount of calcium in the mash water, if that has an impact.
Well, let's start. Which one do you want to start with? Time?
Yes, even though actually the time experiment was an experiment that I did towards the end, I think it is best to discuss the time experiment first, because it does show something about how do these enzymes actually work. And when I say these enzymes, I'm talking about the amylase enzymes that convert the starches into sugars and dextrins.
So how did you set up this experiment, and what were the results? What did you see?
Right. So this experiment was set up as a series of experiments split between two starting temperatures. So I chose a starting temperature of 67 degrees Celsius and 72 degrees Celsius.
67 is around 150, and then 72 would be around 160, somewhere in there.
These are two extremes in temperature. So these 150 degrees or 67 degrees Celsius, that is a common mash temperature that people would use, whereas the 72 degrees Celsius or 162 Fahrenheit, that is towards the very high end already, and I don't think that many people actually mash with that temperature.
Right.
But what I wanted to show here is, or what I wanted to see is, like, how do the fermentability and the extraction, or actually conversion efficiency in the mash change? And with conversion efficiency, I mean the amount of starches that are actually converted into soluble products that then contribute to the starting gravity. And with respect to conversion efficiency, what I found there is that there is a steep rise during the first 15 to 30 minutes of the mash, and then it starts to level off. And the interesting thing in these experiments was that I actually never hit the 100% conversion efficiency. That means even at the longest mash that I did, about almost 300 minutes, even at that time, I did not get all the starches converted, and I don't really know why that is, because I know from my 5-gallon batches that I do to make beer, I can hit 100% conversion after 60 minutes, for instance.
Wow.
But what was clear here is also that the mash at the higher temperature is able to dissolve more of the, or is able to convert more of the starches than the mash at a lower temperature, and it is also able to do that at a much quicker rate. So because I also did an iodine test at the end of each mash, I saw that the conversion of the starch in the liquid was significantly reduced more quickly with the higher temperature mash than with the lower temperature mash, and that was to be expected, because at the higher temperatures the enzymes just work much faster. And when it comes to reaching when it comes to converting the starch, the main enzyme you're looking at is the alpha amylase, which even at a temperature of 162 Fahrenheit is still fairly stable.
We see a kind of a flip-flop in looking at the charts between the higher temperature and the lower temperature as far as the effect on the limit of attenuation and the brew house efficiency. So even though you're squeezing out more sugars with a higher temperature, you're not necessarily going to get a higher fermentability.
Right, and that has to do with the other main enzyme in the starch conversion, and that's the beta amylase. And its problem is that its denaturation temperature is lower than that of the alpha amylase, and it is around 70 degrees. So above 70 degrees, that enzyme gets quickly denatured and then is not able to perform its task anymore, which is to produce maltose from longer dextrin chains. So what you see here in this analysis or in this experiment is that actually initially the rise of fermentability is faster for the higher temperature mash than for the lower temperature mash. But because that enzyme is denatured more quickly at the higher temperature, it then quickly falls behind the performance of the enzyme in the lower temperature mash. And that's an interesting thing that you have to think about when trying to evaluate how does the mash temperature affect your fermentability. It affects that through the effects on the beta amylase. And there's a very interesting analogy that I once read about to that, is that just see that enzyme like an electric motor rated for 10 volts. And if you now apply 5 volts to that motor, it will run very slow, but it can run almost forever. If you apply 10 volts, well, then it will run much faster, but it will have a limited lifetime. And now if you would apply 15 volts to that motor, which is above its rated voltage, then it runs much faster, but maybe dies after an hour. And if you now would apply 20 volts to that motor, it will run even faster, but maybe only for 10 minutes. And that's similar to actually what happens to the beta amylase. If the temperature is higher, it can work quicker, but it will also be denatured much more quickly, such that it cannot produce as much maltose in the duration of the mash as it would have been able to if it would have lived longer, but then operated at a lower temperature.
What do all grain brewers learn about this? What is the most important thing that we can bring out about time with this experiment?
What all grain brewers should know about it is that it takes a certain time to get conversion of the mash. But even once the conversion of the mash is reached, it may take an additional amount of time to actually reach the target of attenuation for the produced wort. And also that attenuation can be improved with extending the time, so can efficiency.
Most of us are doing 60-minute mashes.
Right.
Would our lives be better if we did, say, 90-minute mashes instead?
No, not necessarily. If you can reach your conversion and your limit of attenuation, which is the fermentability, within 60 minutes, there's no problem with that. But if you want to maybe have a much higher attenuation in your beer because you're trying to brew a beer that wants to have very low residual sugars or dextrins left, then you may have to mash at a lower temperature, which will not allow you to get your conversion at 60 minutes, or which also will not allow you to get your targeted attenuation with just 60 minutes. So you may have to extend the mash time to 90 minutes or even longer, or look for a mash schedule that actually tries to get the most out of the beta amylase first and then gradually rises the temperature to get some more conversion, and that's these step mashes that are very beneficial for attenuation.
Is there anything else on time, or are you ready to move on to temperature?
Well, I think that's all I wanted to say about time. One drawback of this experiment was that actually this thermos bottle that I mashed in, even with an added layer of insulation that I wrapped around it, did show a significant temperature drop, and it was over 60 minutes. The temperature drop was about 3 degrees Celsius, which is rather significant, and that's not necessarily what I see when I mash a 5-gallon mash. And what actually happens here is that if the temperature slowly drops, the beta amylase that has been denatured will not come back. So that enzyme is broken, but the rate at which the beta amylase is denatured will slow down, and it will be able to go longer, but at reduced activity because the temperature is lower.
So what about? I'm looking at the temperature chart, and what are we seeing?
Well, so the next thing that I then evaluated was the temperature sensitivity. So I settled on a mash time of 60 minutes, which is regular mash time for most brewers. And I varied the temperature basically through varying the strike water temperature, and that basically was varied through time spent in the microwave to heating it. So it was basically for me I tracked how many minutes in the microwave, how many seconds in the microwave would get me to what strike water temperature, and I would then just vary that time as opposed to trying to hassle with adjusting once I poured the water into the thermos bottle.
And what I'm looking at is it appears to me that the limit of attenuation peaks at around 66 degrees Celsius, which would be, again, at around 150 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yes, I do have about 90% limit of attenuation peak here at 63 degrees Celsius, and that is for a 60-minute mash. Because of the way the enzymes work, that peak would be different for a 30-minute or a 90-minute mash. So, but what I see is that there is a slow rise in fermentability approaching that peak, and then there is a fairly steep drop once the temperature goes beyond the optimal temperature. And in the experiments that I did, I actually found that these attenuation data points beyond the peak actually closely align to a linear function that has a slope of 4% attenuation per degree Celsius temperature increase. This was very interesting for me, and the data that I see in the literature doesn't show that, and I contribute that actually to the rather significant temperature loss that I had during the mash, which basically meant that the beta amylase was not denatured as severely as it would have been the case if the temperature would have truly been constant during the whole mash.
So you started off at around at 60 degrees Celsius, which is around 140 degrees Fahrenheit, and your limit of attenuation at that point was around 80%, and then it peaked at 66 Celsius, around 150 at 90%. So it would be interesting, it's always said that if you want a more fermentable wort, then, maybe, down toward the lower end of the scale is the way to go. But maybe in looking at the data from the previous experiment, it seems if you're wanting to do lower temperatures lower than 150, maybe you should mash for longer than 60 minutes. Is that a fair extrapolation?
Yes, and the problem is that if the temperature is really low, then you don't have as much enzyme activity, and you may actually not get conversion during these 60 minutes. So what I also did at the end of each mash is an iodine test, and when the temperature was well below the 66 degrees Celsius, actually I still saw native starch being present in the mash, which means that the conversion wasn't complete, and that would have also caused a problem later on where you get starch into the boil that then would carry over into the beer and produce a haze that you can't get rid of. So it's always important that you do mash until you get conversion, and that you basically choose your mash temperature based on the target that you have for attenuation. And if that attenuation target is too high to be reached in a 60-minute mash, well, then you may have to go to a longer mash. So
patience, and then testing with an iodine test to make sure that your conversion is complete.
Yes, especially if you want to work towards the extremes, which is if you want to work with especially low mash temperatures, then I strongly recommend that you actually do an iodine test to make sure that at the end of the mash, the starches, at least all the starches that are in the mash liquid, that they are converted.
So any more words on temperature?
No, I think that's it, and we can continue on to the next parameter that was evaluated.
pH.
Yes, this is a big one, and it gets more and more traction as more and more brewers actually become aware of the importance of the mash pH. Initially, when you start out brewing, generally there's not so much emphasis put on, because if you mix malt and regular colored malt, like so medium colored beer, and water of medium hardness together, then generally pH falls into a good enough range for you to convert starches to sugars and make wort.
So it kind of takes care of itself.
It does to some extent take care of itself. There are problems, of course, if the water is too hard or too soft, or if the malt is too light or too dark, and that the mixture of the two of them do not result in the proper mash pH. And this experiment was designed to evaluate the effect that the mash pH has on the attenuation and the conversion of the mash. And what I did, all the mashes were done with reverse osmosis water, which is very soft, and with Pilsner malt. And to change the pH, I would either add vinegar or baking soda solution to lower the pH in case of vinegar, or to raise the pH in case of the baking soda. And I would then, at the end of the mash, measure a room temperature sample of the mash with a pH meter and with the color fast strips that are fairly precise or fairly good strips to read pH.
And it's fairly easy from the chart to see where the sweet spot is, and it's around where we expect to see it, right?
Right. So the ideal mash pH in terms of attenuation and also in terms of extraction is around 5.5 for a room temperature sample, and it would be around 5.2 if that sample would have been measured at mash pH temperatures, because there is a 0.35 difference due to the higher temperature. And what I found is that once your pH drops below like 5.2, 5.0, your attenuation starts to decline significantly, and also your conversion rate. So that means that you will end up with a lower starting gravity, and you will end up with a lower attenuation, and because of the low conversion, you may even end up with starch left over in the mash, or in the wort, because not all the starch was converted. And the same is true for raising the pH, let's say past 5.75. Then the attenuation drops, and also the extraction efficiency drops, and that just has to do with the pH optima that the alpha and the beta amylase have. Both have an optimum around 5.5 mash pH for a room temperature sample.
So if you're having some problems getting good brew house efficiency, get some pH strips.
Yes, actually, yes. Get some pH strips and test your mash pH, and also read up on residual alkalinity, which is a parameter of the mash water that, together with the malt, will determine your mash pH. And one interesting point that I actually want to make regarding a low mash pH and attenuation and conversion issues is that if you plan to make a sour beer through sour mashing, then this data suggests that you actually want to add the soured mash towards the end of the mash, so that you drop your mash pH before you've gotten the most out of your amylase enzymes, and that you actually achieve the attenuation and the efficiency that you wanted.
That's a good point. So you get the work done, and with the mash, and then you add the sour stuff at the end.
Right. But I have not brewed a sour beer yet, so I'm not sure if that theory holds true.
And I would imagine it would depend also on maybe the size of the sour mash that you actually did, whether it would impact your larger mash pH significantly. But again, another reason to get some testing strips.
Yes. I think these testing strips are the best value for the money that you can get. It's great to have a pH meter, but they do require some maintenance. And if you're just starting out to worry about this, just these strips will do fine. Even though I did find a significant error between readings from the strips and readings from a pH meter, but not big enough that it would actually have a very large impact on being out of the optimal range.
And it's better than nothing.
Yes, it's better than nothing.
Are you ready to talk about the crush or the mill of the grain?
Yes, this is another important or interesting mash parameter, and that also gets a lot of traction in the discussion boards online. Is that what people are seeing is that if they start milling their own grain, and especially if they start milling their own grain at a much tighter mill gap, they see a jump in efficiency. And that's also what I observed when I did mashes with grains milled between 0.35 and 0.95 millimeters, and that range in mill would be about between 13 and 39 mils. And up to that point, I actually thought that this is about the range where people would mill their grain in. But then I later found that a lot of homebrew stores and a lot of malt mills have a default setting that is actually even wider, up to 1.4 millimeter in some cases, which is around 50 mil. And that, I feel, is actually way too coarse of a crush, because the barley kernel is only about 1.8 millimeter wide.
Yeah, and in personal experience, I found that once I started crushing my own grain, my efficiency went up as well. So, that's one of the biggest pieces of advice that I give people if they're having poor efficiency is either mill your own grain or run it through twice,
Right.
if you're at the store. But you're saying that with your data that it doesn't reflect that much of a difference.
Well, it does reflect about 10% difference between the finest crush that I had and the coarsest crush. It's not as much as I thought it would be, but it certainly shows the trend that if you mill finer, then more starch will be available to the enzymes, and the enzymes don't really have to work on breaking open these the grits where the starch is locked away, and that even with well modified malts, the tightness of the mill gap spacing makes a significant impact on the extraction efficiency. And this, I think, has to do just with the low intensity nature that a single infusion mash has. So if the malt sits there in water, is not agitated really significantly, and the only forces that actually liberate the starch is just the enzymes and the gelatinization of the starch kernels. And the smaller you make the pieces, and the easier you make it for the water to access these starch granules, the more starch you will be able to convert in the given time, and ideally also the better attenuation you will get. Although I did not see a significant change in attenuation as I just ground the malt finer and finer, which was surprising. So
it is a significant factor, an important factor, but within the parameters that you measured, it wasn't as dramatic a factor as you thought it would be.
No, it wasn't. But also you have to keep in mind that for some reason this experiment or these experiments never reached the full potential of conversion, and I have not figured that out yet why exactly it is. If it really is the rather large temperature drop, or if there's something to these experiments that make them so different from my regular mashes, where I don't have a problem in converting all the starch and the malt, even if I mill at only 0.65 millimeter, which is about 26 mil.
But the line that you've got to traverse is, if you don't grind fine enough, you won't get the starches to convert. But if you mill too fine, you'll get stuck sparges and stuck lautering.
Yes, that's the trade-off. That the finer you mill, the slower your runoff will be, maybe even to the point that you will set your mash, and it will be much more hassle for you than you would have had if you would have just milled coarser and would have lived with a lower extraction efficiency. And I think that's also the reasoning why a lot of homebrew stores and mill such coarse grists, and why also mills are set up by default to mill rather coarsely, such that they err on the safe side of creating a hassle-free brew day. But if you pay attention to these, if you just slowly dial it down and see when is the point that I actually get all the starches from my mash, and then that's where you basically want to be, or maybe a little bit coarser. If you would go any further after you actually already able to reach all the starches in the mash, then it doesn't make a change anymore.
What about mash thickness? I mean, we've heard that a thinner mash gives you a more fermentable wort. Is that true?
That's not what I found. The mash thickness experiments were done at two different thicknesses. A thick mash at around 2.5 liters per kilogram, that translates to about 1.25 quart per pound, and a thin mash that was done at about 5 liter per kilogram, which translates to about 2.5 quarts per pound. And what I found is that there is no difference in the limit of attenuation that you get from both mash thicknesses. So both mash thicknesses produce an equally fermentable wort. And I did that by capturing a few temperature data points for each mash thickness, and the curves for both mash thicknesses, they basically align with what I found earlier in the temperature experiment. But what I found, where I found a significant difference was in the extraction efficiency. The thinner mash performed much better at extracting or at converting the starches into sugars than the thicker mashes. The difference I found here in this experiment was as large as about 8 to 10%.
Wow!
And that was surprising, and it also suggests to me that if there are brewers that are having efficiency problems and are using the standard mash thickness of 1.25 quart per pound, they may try just thinning out that mash. Just go up to 2 quarts per pound, and those mashes are generally much easier to stir. So it's easier to settle and take the temperature, and also it's easier to stir in adjustments that you may have to the mash pH. But these mashes I saw perform the sugars from the mash than the thick mashes, and with an equal fermentability.
Wow. Would there be a disadvantage to adding more water to the mash tun?
I don't think so. Actually, my brewing background is mostly German styles, and thin mashes starting from 1.5 or 1 3/4 quart per pound up to maybe 2.5 quart per pound is just standard because these mashes also historically had to be able to be pumped, as opposed to the English style mashes, which were thicker, but they didn't have to be pumped because they were just sitting in a mash tun at one temperature. And the mash tun was also used to lauter these mashes. So that's where I actually think the standard mash thickness of 1.25 quarts per pound comes from. It comes from the English style of brewing.
I think I'm going to change that the next time I brew.
Yeah, give it a try. You don't have to worry that your pH will get out of whack. There's enough buffering capacity to keep it right there, even if you go to a thicker mash. Even if you go to a thinner mash, I mean.
And that's something that's easy to fix, to change. So
yes,
why not?
Exactly, why not? Actually, it's another benefit of thin mash is actually that you will have less sponge water. And, well, the reason why this is a benefit is the less you sponge, the less tannins you will extract.
Well, there you go. What about the malt type? We've heard that the different types of malt and different malts that are kilned at different temperatures and to various degrees of kilning have different enzymatic powers. How do they affect attenuation?
Well, if there are less enzymes available, then the whole conversion process will be slower. And also because the beta amylase is or has a denaturing point that is lower than that of the alpha amylase. That also means that it will suffer more under the kilning than the alpha amylase. So that means there will be proportionally less beta amylase available in highly killed malts than there is in low temperature killed malts. And as a result, which I also found in my experiments, is that the limit of attenuation of the wort that you produce will be less. And there's also a slight drop in conversion efficiency. So
that's what you expected, basically.
Yes, that's what I expected, and I also got reminded of that in batches that I brewed recently, where I brewed in all Munich malt, all dark Munich malt, double bock, and then also an all dark Munich malt, dunkel, where I just saw much lower attenuation than I generally see at that mash time and temperature. And the same was also true with the dunkel, and I basically had to brew it again also to just change the mash profile to get a better attenuation from the mash. And I also saw that it took much longer for these mashes to convert, meaning that it took much longer until the iodine test was negative. So that's why I just want to put out a warning that if you attempt to mash with 100% dark Munich malt, for example, that you should pay close attention to the conversion process through an iodine test, or that you may want to add about 20% of Pilsner malt to the grist to just have a little enzymatic insurance against the low enzymatic power of the Munich malt.
That makes sense. Just a little octane boost there in the
basically.
In the mash tun.
It removes some hassles from your brew day, because unfortunately that brew day got pushed out a little because I just was waiting for the mash to convert, and then I had to raise the temperature to just get the alpha amylase a little more active and speed up the conversion process. But if you get a significant amount of conversion done through a higher temperature rest, for instance, like a mash out, then you have to keep in mind that all you're producing is unfermentable sugars. Then that you're driving up you're driving down your fermentability at that point.
That's a good point. Yeah, it makes me wonder. I did iodine tests when I first started all grain brewing. I did iodine tests every single brew day. But then as I gained more confidence and, more kind of predictability with what I was doing, I haven't done an iodine test in a long time. So it kind of makes me curious, am I actually getting the job done? I'm just kind of assuming that since I'm doing the similar beers in a similar fashion, similar temperatures, similar times, that everything is okay. And I'm getting good beers. But it just makes me wonder if I'm actually being patient long enough.
Right. I don't think that there's a problem with stopping doing an iodine test if the beers are the same, if the water stays the same, if the grist composition is mostly a highly enzymatic malt like pale malt. Mm-hmm. But if you're trying to experiment with, let's say, a sour mash, if you're trying to experiment with a large amount of highly kilned malts, if you do decoction mashes where you have a lot of boiling, meaning that you also kill a lot of the enzymes, it is a good idea to keep track of the conversion process through an iodine test. And one thing I found very helpful for the iodine test is actually to do that iodine test on a piece of chalk instead of the typical white saucer. So you just take a single drop from your mash, and I just take it off my thermometer. You put that on a piece of chalk, and you add a drop of iodine solution, and then you can see right there, without the effect of any spent grain that it may have or any ambiguity, whether or not the reaction is still purple or if it is a little bit more mahogany or red or if it's gone completely.
That's a good tip.
And the pictures that I have on my website regarding these iodine tests, they are all pictures of basically an iodine test done on chalk, and you can kind of see what does it look? I mean, what does an unconverted mash look like? What does a converted mash look like?
The last parameter that you looked at was calcium.
Yes, and I actually started looking at that because, as I mentioned before, I just did not see the amount of conversion in these mini mashes that I generally see from my larger mashes, and I thought, well, maybe that's caused by me just using reverse osmosis water for the mash water, and maybe there is some effect that a higher mineral content can have on that. And also found literature that said that calcium does have an effect on the stability of alpha amylase, which should not really come into play yet because the temperatures at which we mash, they are not yet close enough to a point where a lot of the alpha amylase starts to denature and become unstable. But still, I did 4 mashes where I just changed the calcium content in the mash water by blending a highly calcium-rich water with just distilled water. And I made sure that the highly calcium-rich water that actually has a residual alkalinity of 0, such that it actually does not, that the amount of calcium that is added does not change the pH. So the balance between calcium and bicarbonates stays the same, but the amount of calcium changes. And what I found is that changing the amount of calcium has hardly any effect on the fermentability and hardly any effect on the extraction efficiency, even though the data that I have here shows a slight trend towards higher extraction efficiency for more calcium and lower attenuation for more calcium. But the difference is just 1 or 2%, so it's within the statistical error, I would say.
Are there any other parameters that you didn't check for that you want to continue on and check for still?
One parameter that I would be interested is, for instance, what's the effect of stirring the mash versus not stirring the mash? So basically the mechanical agitation, how does that affect the extraction efficiency? And I would expect that aids the efficiency because now you have some more forces working on the mash that can liberate starch. But keep in mind, if you're already getting all the starches converted in the mash, then doing something more to the mash will not help your efficiency because there's nothing more to get. So that's actually why I think that some brewers see an effect on their efficiency if they, for instance, mash longer, or if they, for instance, adjust their pH to the perfect spot, or if they grind finer, whereas other brewers don't see that effect, and that may as well be that those brewers who don't see the effect, well, they are already at the limit of what they can get with efficiency.
Well, this is extremely interesting, and I hope that people will go to your website, and we'll put a link to your website or to the PDF document in the description of this episode on basicbrewingradio.com. And right. It really helps to when you're listening to this to look at the charts and kind of follow along because it makes a lot more sense.
Right, and just what I kind of want to add as a final note is that it is a complicated subject, and there are so many things, and I hope that your listeners are not worried about suddenly now about their mashes, but that gave them some insight of more what things affect the mash, and at the end, practical ways of controlling the fermentability are still the temperature and the time to some extent, but you have to keep in mind as you are changing things like especially the type of grain or the compositions in your grist, or as the pH changes as you change the water, that can also have an effect on your fermentability, and that you cannot necessarily translate one rest temperature that works for one recipe to actually to another recipe, because it may give you a different attenuation.
Yeah, if you understand all the variables of what's going on in your mash tun, then you can feel more comfortable in changing things and understanding when things don't come out right. You kind of can look at the conditions going into the mash, and if you've changed certain things and they've had an effect and they go along with what you're saying in these experiments, then you can say, well, there you go. I know what to do next time. So,
yeah, exactly.
I appreciate all your work. This is a lot of work, and I appreciate it. And I know that those who want to pursue it further will also appreciate it as well. And if I get email or questions on the topic, I will forward them on to you.
Well, thanks. Yeah.
Thanks, Kai. And thanks to Russ again for allowing us to use your studio.
Yes, thank you.
Well, thanks again to Kai and Russ. Be sure to follow the link from the description of this episode on basicbrewingradio.com to Kai's research. Because in my opinion, the more you know about what's going on in your mash tun, and the more you can measure it, the more control that you'll have over your wort and subsequently your beers. Excellent stuff. Great stuff. I really appreciate Kai sharing his work with us, and I hope that if he continues, that he'll keep us in mind and keep us updated. Remember, we've got Brewers logbooks here for everybody who wants one, and our new Basic Winemaking Introduction to Wine Kits DVD. They're out there on our online store. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. You can check out our other DVDs, our low-tech lagering and decoction mashing DVD. Also, you can check out our Introduction to Extract homebrewing DVD if you're just getting started, or if you want to give a present to somebody who needs to get into the hobby. Also, we have Stepping into All Grain, where we get you into the all grain process. And maybe you listen to this episode and you're an extract brewer and you don't know what we're talking about with the mash. You need to start doing all grain. It's a lot of fun. It's not as hard as you might think. We got combo deals on the site, and you can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it online from us in our shop on basicbrewingshop.com. And I'll box it up myself. And it's getting cooler, at least here in the Northern Hemisphere, but we still got shirts for everybody. And we also appreciate everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We appreciate the support there. Featured products this week that were purchased through the link are Samsung LN37A 450 37-inch 72p LCD HD TV, and Toot and Puddle, the Great Cheese Chase. Kind of reminds me of when the boys were in diapers. Toot and Puddle. Thanks again, everybody. And remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries there. Cracking myself up as usual. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping. We appreciate your support. And we also have an associate link to the Apple Store on the site as well. That's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson, our buddy in Austin. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.